In this next section, we are going to look at splitting our labour costs for our production line worker into the direct labour costs and the indirect labour costs. Now really, there's a number of key rules you need to learn in relation to what would be considered direct and what would be indirect. Before I tell you what those are, I just want to introduce an important concept. For our production line workers, the total hours paid will be equal to productive hours plus idle time. Now, idle time are the hours where our production line workers, for some reason, are unable to be producing units. So perhaps because of machine breakdown, they have to wait until an engineer arrives to fix the machinery, and they are not productive during that time. Or if we run out of materials, they have to wait for our new order to arrive. So our idle time is the time our production line workers spend unable to physically produce units. Now this will be important when we're separating out our production line workers' wages between direct and indirect. Remember also, if we're looking at an hourly payment system, the other thing we will need to consider is the overtime premium we pay them for hours worked after 5 o'clock. And then we also have perhaps a bonus. So if we're thinking about then which of these costs are direct and which are indirect. Very straightforward. When we're calculating the direct costs, there are only two things we ever have to consider. The first is the productive hours at the basic rate. So the number of productive hours multiplied by the basic rate for our production line workers will always be a direct cost. The second thing we may have in our direct costs, although it's not very common, is the overtime premium if the overtime was requested by a customer. What I mean here is that if a customer specifically asks us to request our staff to work overtime, so we might receive a customer order on a Tuesday and they say to us, it's very, very urgent, can you have it delivered to us by tomorrow morning? If that is the case, then our staff may have to work overtime to get that job completed quickly because the customer has requested it. And if that is the case, the overtime premium will be charged to our customer because they requested early completion and would be considered a direct cost. Now these are the only two things which would ever be classified as a direct cost in relation to our production line workers. Everything else then is going to be indirect costs. So when we're calculating our indirect costs, the first thing we will have is our idle time hours multiplied by the basic rate. So for our basic rate payment, then we split that into two. Our basic rate for the productive hours is a direct cost. Our basic rate for the idle time hours is an indirect cost. The second thing we have relates to our overtime premium again. This is the overtime premium if the overtime was not specifically requested. So if our staff are working overtime, not because a particular customer requested early completion, but just because our factory is generally busy, if that is the case, then our overtime premium, so the extra bit we pay for those hours, would be an indirect cost. And finally, in our indirect costs, we would also have any bonus we pay to our production line workers. This will always be considered indirect. So let's have a look at an exercise then that brings all of these ideas together. So we're told Johnson is paid by the hour. She gets £7.50 an hour as her basic rate and an overtime premium of £2.50 for any hours above 40. Now she assembles seed propagators, and each propagator should take 30 minutes to complete. This is the standard time or hours allowed for each unit. We'll use this in our bonus calculation. Johnson is paid a bonus of 50% of time saved based on her standard hourly rate. So for each hour she saves in her production, she will get paid 50% of her basic rate. Last week she was at work for 54 hours. So these are her total hours paid. Though 4 of these were lost due to machine breakdown. So she was sitting around for 4 hours doing nothing because the machine had broken down. This is idle time. She assembled 124 propagators that week. So her actual production was 124 units. And we need to work out how much of her wages will be direct cost and how much would be indirect. In a question like this, it's always easier to start with the direct costs because there will be less in there. So, starting with the direct costs then, we only have 2 things to consider: productive hours at the basic rate and overtime premium if the overtime was specifically requested by a customer. So, first of all, let's look at her productive hours at the basic rate. How many productive hours did she have? Well, we're told she worked 54 hours in total and there were 4 hours of idle time, which means her productive hours must have been her total hours minus the idle time hours, so 50. Multiply this by the basic rate of £7.50 and we get 375. Our next consideration then, indirect costs, overtime premium if specifically requested. Now we know that Johnson's basic working week is 40 hours and we know that she has worked in total 54 hours. So she's definitely worked overtime and been paid an overtime premium. Was this overtime specifically requested by a customer? Well, were we told in the question that a customer specifically requested it? No. If the overtime has been requested by a customer, you would have to be told that in the question. If not, you can assume that the overtime was worked because the factory is generally busy, which means all of the overtime premium is going to be an indirect cost, which means as far as our direct costs go, we're done. £375 in total. Everything else is going to be an indirect cost. So going through our indirect cost calculation, the first thing we need to consider is our idle time hours. So the basic rate we paid for each of these idle time hours will be an indirect cost. We're told our idle time hours were 4 hours. Our basic rate is £7.50. So that gives us a total of £30. Our next consideration in our indirect costs is our overtime premium, not specifically requested. So this will be calculated as our overtime hours multiplied by the premium we paid for each of those hours. So how many hours of overtime has Johnson worked? Let's look back at the question. We're told she gets overtime for any hours worked above 40 hours. And we're told as well that in total she was at work for 54 hours. So her overtime hours were the difference between her total hours worked and her basic hours. So her overtime premium will be paid for 54 minus 40, so 14 hours, multiplied by the overtime premium per hour of £2.50 gives us 35. And finally then, our last indirect cost will be the bonus. We've been told that Johnson is entitled to some kind of bonus, so we're going to have to do our calculation to work out what that was. Remember, when we're doing our bonus calculation, first we will look at the standard hours for actual production. This is the actual units they have produced multiplied by the standard time per unit. If we look back at our exercise, we were told that Johnson assembled 124 propagators that week. We were also told that the standard time, or each propagator should take 30 minutes. So if we go back to our bonus calculation, she has produced 124 units, and in hours, how long do we expect that to take? Well, if we expect each unit to take 30 minutes, that would be 0.5 hours. So if she has produced 124 units, we would expect that to take 62 hours in total. Now we need to compare this to the actual time taken. And we need to be careful here. How long has it taken Johnson to produce these 124 units? Well, we have been told that she was at work for 54 hours. However, 4 of those hours were idle time when there was a machine breakdown and she could not be productive. It has taken Johnson 50 hours to produce these units. So when we're looking at the time taken, we're looking at the productive hours. So the hours where she was physically able to be producing units. And we said that her productive hours were 50. So the time saved is just the difference between the two of 12 hours. Once we've done that, it's just straightforward. We were told in the question, for 50% of the time saved, she'll be paid her basic rate. So we just need to multiply our time saved by 50%, multiplied by the basic rate of $7.50, and that gives us her bonus. We work through, you should get £45. So that's the final piece of our calculations. We'll just bring that in to our wages calculation. Our final indirect cost is our bonus of £45. So our total indirect cost will be our idle time hours, which were £30, plus our overtime premiums, which were £35, plus the bonus of £45. And that gives us £110 in total.